The man who made the world afraid to look away from the screen never once asked to be seen. He stood in the shadows of his own mythology, carved from coal dust and silence, forged through poverty so absolute it had no language, only a weight that pressed against the chest every waking hour. His face became the most recognized face in cinema across 3 continents, not because he pursued fame, but because something in that weathered, angular stillness spoke to every man who had ever survived something he was never supposed to survive. He did not play heroes who conquered the world. He played men who simply refused to be broken by it. And that distinction, quiet as it seemed, was everything. But what the audiences never saw, what the film posters never hinted at, what the action sequences never revealed, was the one force in Charles Bronson's life that softened the granite, that unlocked something private and radiant behind those eyes. Her name was Jill Ireland, and the promise he made to her, in the darkest chapter of both their lives, would turn out to be the most important performance he ever gave. Not on a set, not in front of a camera, in a hospital room, holding her hand, refusing to leave. That promise, and what it cost him, is the story Hollywood never told. To understand what Charles Bronson gave up for Jill Ireland, you first have to understand what the darkness had already taken from him long before she ever arrived. He was born Charles Dennis Bukinski on November 3, 1921, in Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, a town so small, so consumed by the coal industry, that its children grew up breathing dust before they ever breathed fresh air. He was the 11th of 15 children, born to Lithuanian immigrant parents who had crossed an ocean searching for something better and found themselves in the particular American struggle of the early 20th century, working harder than the body could sustain for wages that never quite covered what life demanded. The house was crowded, cold in winter, and poor in a way that wasn't romantic or cinematic. It was simply grinding and relentless, the kind of poverty that doesn't announce itself with drama, but wears people down, year after year, until the shine goes out of their eyes. Charles's father died when the boy was 10 years old. 10 years old, and suddenly one of the oldest males in a household that had no margin for grief. There was no space for mourning in that world. There was only the question of what came next, of who would work, of how the family would eat through another Pennsylvania winter. Charles absorbed that reality with the same stoic endurance he would carry for the rest of his life, a silence that wasn't emptiness, but a container for everything he could not afford to say out loud. But that unbreakable exterior had been forged in a much darker place than anyone watching the films would ever guess. The coal mine came for him not long after, an inevitability in Ehrenfeld, where the mine was not just the local employer, but the organizing principle of existence. He descended into the earth as a teenager, working as a car loader in tunnels, where the ceiling pressed low, and the darkness was total, and the coal dust hung in the air like something alive. The claustrophobia of it, the absence of light, the way the vibration of the earth itself became something familiar. These were not the materials of adventure. They were the materials of survival. And Charles Bukinski survived them without complaint, because complaint was a luxury that Ehrenfeld had never offered him. He worked the mines in the same shirt his brother had worn before him, in the only pair of boots the family owned in his size. On some days, that was the whole story. What burned quietly inside him during those years underground was a ferocious, unspoken refusal. Not rage, not bitterness, simply a refusal to accept that this was the only possible life. He did not know yet what else existed. He only knew that something else had to. And then the war came, and with it, a way out. He enlisted and served as a tail gunner on a B-29 Superfortress in the Pacific Theater during the World War II, a position that required a particular combination of nerve and coldness, sitting alone in a glass bubble at the rear of a bomber, watching the sky for enemy fighters, entirely exposed. He flew multiple combat missions and was awarded the Air Medal. He had, by the time the war ended, already understood something about mortality that most men his age were still intellectually learning, that life could end in an instant, that the body was fragile, and that survival was not a guarantee, but the result of choices made under extreme pressure. He came back from the Pacific changed in the way all survivors are changed, carrying things that had no name, that could not be filed or processed or left behind on foreign soil. He used the GI Bill to study art. That detail, small, unremarked in most accounts of his life, reveals something about his interior world that his exterior never gave away. The man who would one day intimidate audiences with a single glance was, at his core, someone who wanted to make beautiful things. He gravitated toward painting with the same quiet intensity he brought to everything, not casually, not recreationally, but with a commitment that suggested the act of putting paint on canvas was, for him, a form of necessary speech. He drifted toward acting not as a dream, but as a practical opportunity, a way to stay connected to something creative, while the world decided what it wanted to do with a young man from Pennsylvania who had survived the mines and the war and was not especially interested in returning to either. He took classes. He worked in summer stock. He was not immediately remarkable in the conventional sense. He was quieter than most actors, less willing to perform in the theatrical way that training often encouraged, less interested in the acrobatics of charisma that drama coaches treated as the whole of the craft. But something happened when the cameras found him, something that no amount of training could manufacture. The stillness that made him awkward in social situations became magnetic on screen. Directors noticed it before audiences did, the way Bronson could stand completely still in a frame and pull all the energy of the scene toward himself without dominating the action, but simply being the still point around which everything else moved. He changed his name from Bukinski to Bronson in 1954, shedding one identity and constructing another. The boy from Ehrenfeld did not disappear. He simply became the foundation upon which the man on the screen was built. The roles came slowly, supporting parts, ensemble work, the kind of acting that requires discipline more than inspiration. He appeared in The Magnificent Seven in 1960, sharing the screen with a constellation of talent, and held his own the way a mountain holds its own against wind, not by competing, but by simply being there, unmovable. He worked in television, in westerns, in crime films, consistent and quiet, and without the fanfare the industry typically extended to rising stars, because Bronson was not a man who generated fanfare. He generated something quieter and harder to define, a gravitational pull, a quality that critics struggled to put words to, and audiences felt in their chests before they could explain why. And the real story was never the roles he played. It was the life accumulating behind them. Then the world that didn't know him yet, specifically Europe, and then Japan, and then the vast international market that Hollywood was only beginning to understand, discovered him, and everything shifted. The box office numbers that began pouring in from France, from Italy, from Japan in the early 1970s were, by any measure, staggering. He was, in certain markets, the highest-paid actor in the world, not a rumor. A documented, verifiable fact that Hollywood received with the particular discomfort of an industry realizing it had underestimated something it couldn't fully categorize. Audiences in Tokyo and Paris lined up for Bronson films the way American audiences lined up for the biggest stars the studio system could manufacture. There were Bronson billboards in cities where American westerns were supposed to be exotic novelties. Fan clubs in countries where his name had barely registered a decade earlier. What was it that international audiences recognized? The answer, when examined carefully, is almost unbearably human. He looked like someone who had actually suffered. not performed suffering through the technical vocabulary of dramatic training, but carried the actual residue of a life that had demanded everything. In a cinema landscape populated by actors whose faces suggested ease, whose eyes suggested a world in which hardship was a concept rather than an experience, Bronson's face was different. It was a topographic map of endurance. Every line, every shadow communicated something that could not be faked, the knowledge of what it costs to survive. And audiences who had survived things themselves, working-class audiences, immigrant audiences, people who had watched their parents grind through difficult decades, felt, watching Bronson, that someone on that enormous screen finally understood their experience of the world. He was not playing a fantasy. He was playing a man. But the man behind the screen was carrying something that none of those international billboards could contain. By the time Death Wish transformed him into a domestic American phenomenon in 1974, Bronson had been married to Jill Ireland for 6 years. She was British, luminous, a woman of genuine intelligence and warmth who had built her own career in film and television. They had met years earlier when she was still married to another actor. The story of their first encounter had taken on a kind of mythological quality in Hollywood circles. Bronson had reportedly told her husband, upon their introduction, that he intended to marry his wife someday. It was the kind of line that sounded like dialogue. It was not. Bronson was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he rarely said things at all. What he said, he meant completely. And in this case, as in most things he committed to, he was right. By the mid-1970s, they were the kind of couple that generates its own atmosphere. They made 11 films together over the course of their marriage, a collaboration that spoke not of professional strategy, but of something simpler and more fundamental. They did not want to be apart. Crew members who worked with them during this period would later describe something difficult to articulate in the hard language of film production. A tenderness between them that existed outside of time. A private warmth that persisted through the noise and chaos of busy sets, in moments between takes, in the quiet of trailers, when the machinery of filmmaking offered them a few minutes to simply exist together. At the Vermont property where they made their home, away from the industry's noise and the press's appetite, Bronson painted, not as a hobby, not as a therapeutic distraction, as a genuine pursuit, oils on canvas, landscapes and portraits, and abstractions that revealed a visual sensitivity his films never had occasion to express. The man whose hands on screen, wrapped around threats and conflicts, and the metallic weight of movie props, were the same hands that held a thin paintbrush with careful precision in a studio that smelled of turpentine and linseed oil. Very few journalists ever saw that room. Bronson was not interested in showing it to them. The paintings were not for publicity. They were for himself and for Jill, who understood, without being told, as she understood most things about him, that the brush and the canvas were the parts of him the camera could never access. The box office numbers were extraordinary. The legend was growing. And then everything that mattered changed direction. In 1984, Jill Ireland was diagnosed with breast cancer. The word arrived in the silence that follows truly devastating news. A silence that is not absence, but the presence of everything that suddenly needs to be rethought, all at once, without warning. She was 48 years old. She was by every measure at the height of her life, experienced and fully engaged with the world she had chosen and the man she had chosen it with. Bronson was on the phone with his agent within days, not to discuss his next film, but to begin clearing his calendar. This was not a decision that generated press releases. He did not announce it. He did not grant interviews about it. He simply made it with the same quiet finality he brought to everything that mattered. Projects in negotiation were set aside, roles that would have kept him on location for months, roles the industry expected him to take, because the industry always expects its stars to keep moving, were declined without elaboration. His manager would later describe the conversations as brief. Bronson's position was not open to discussion. He was going to be with his wife. The years that followed were not defined by drama in the Hollywood sense. There was no single climactic scene that could be isolated and replayed. What there was instead was the slow, difficult, quietly extraordinary labor of loving someone through something terrible. Hospital appointments and treatment schedules, and the specific exhaustion that descends over a household navigating serious illness. The kind of exhaustion that requires nothing from anyone except the willingness to show up, day after day, without applause or recognition, or any audience at all. He showed up. Jill fought with a courage that those who witnessed it found nearly impossible to describe, with language that felt proportionate. She wrote about her experience publicly, a book titled Life Wish, published in 1987, in which she spoke with openness and precision about the physical and emotional reality of living with cancer, about the fear and the determination that coexisted within her, about the love that surrounded her. She described Bronson's presence simply as a fact of her existence, which was perhaps the most accurate description possible. He was there. He was always there. That was the whole sentence, and it needed no elaboration. They continued to work together when her health permitted, a stubborn, almost defiant refusal to let the illness consume the entirety of their shared life. Colleagues who worked with them during this period spoke about the atmosphere on those sets. Not grim, not weighed down in the way one might have expected, but quietly charged with intentionality. Every moment of work was being held more carefully than usual, because both of them understood, with a clarity that most people spend their whole lives resisting, exactly how finite time really is. What happened next gave that iconic weathered stare a completely different meaning. Jill Ireland died on May 18, 1990. She was 54 years old. The announcement traveled through the industry quickly, and with the particular sadness of a world registering the loss of someone it had perhaps not fully valued while she was alive. For Bronson, there is no language adequate to the event, and no account that would do it justice. He did not speak publicly about it at any length. He did not grant interviews in which he tried to articulate the grief. He simply carried it forward, in the way he had always carried the things that were too important for words. Those close to him during the months that followed described a man navigating a landscape that was fundamentally changed. The Vermont home, which had been alive with children and color, and the warmth she had generated wherever she was, became quieter in a way that was more than atmospheric. The studio where he painted still smelled of turpentine. The canvases were still there, but the work shifted, became more introspective, more willing to sit inside darkness without reaching for resolution. He was working through something that resisted being worked through, and the paintings were the only place he was willing to show it. He continued acting through the 1990s, not triumphantly, not with the box office thunder of the earlier decades, but with the particular persistence of a man who needed structure, who needed the craft of filmmaking to give the days shape and purpose. He was not the international phenomenon of 20 years earlier, but he was still present, still working, still carrying forward the identity built from coal dust and war and the quiet refusal to be reduced. He died on August 30, 2003, from pneumonia in Los Angeles. He was 81 years old. What remains, long after the obituaries and the retrospectives and the careful cataloguing of a filmography that spanned 5 decades, is not simply an image, though that image, those dark eyes, and that singular face with its quality of stillness that could read as threat or as sorrow, depending entirely on what you brought to it, remains in the cultural memory with a persistence that most careers never achieve. What remains is the shape of a life built not from ambition in its ordinary definition, but from the stubbornness of someone who had been told, by poverty and by circumstance, exactly what he was permitted to want, and who had simply, quietly, refused to accept those terms. He carried coal out of the earth as a teenager. He flew bombing missions in a war that did not spare the men beside him. He built a career from nothing, in an industry that wasn't initially sure what to do with him. And when the worst thing came for the woman he loved, he chose her over everything the industry could offer, not heroically, not as a gesture, but because it was the only choice available to the man he actually was, beneath the mythology, beneath the silence, beneath the face that generations of audiences feared, and very few ever fully understood. The promise he made to Jill Ireland was never spoken in a single sentence. It was made the way the most real promises always are, not with words, but with presence, with showing up, with setting down the script and sitting beside her in the room where the Vermont light fell through the window and covered everything equally, without preference, without any awareness of what it was illuminating or how little time was left. That is the story the posters never told. That is the man the camera could never quite reach, no matter how long it lingered on that extraordinary face. Not a vigilante, not a myth, not the dangerous persona that cinema constructed and audiences consumed and critics catalogued in the language of genre and spectacle. Just a man who had survived the dark, who had found something luminous inside it, and who spent the second half of his life making sure that light was never, for even a single moment, left alone. The weathered face is still there, in every frame of film he ever made. But now, if you look carefully, past the silence, past the stillness, past the theatrical weight of all that earned menace, you can see something else in those eyes, something that was always there, waiting to be understood. The look of a man who knew exactly what mattered, and who had long since made his peace with everything it had cost him to protect it.